Persona is a very interesting series that has gone from a small niche sub-series of Shin Megami Tensei to its own thing separated from the SMT branding and jumped into the mainstream when Persona 5 hit the PlayStation 3 and 4. But it's always been a big franchise for handhelds. The PlayStation Portable had remakes of 1, both versions of 2, and 3, plus the Vita got Persona 4 Golden, bringing nearly the entire franchise into one ecosystem of handheld consoles. Now, while we don't have everything on a modern handheld, we do have the big three of the series. We're going to go in chronological order as we trek through it on Nintendo's hybrid console. Starting things off, here is my review of Persona 3 Portable for the Nintendo Switch. When it comes to story, P3 takes place on a man-made island housing a high school. You are a new arrival, finding yourself surrounded by strange events, like the world turning green, people turning into coffins, and horrific monsters attacking those that stay conscious during this evil part of the day known as the Dark Hour. You're soon recruited into a group that fight against these monsters using the power of Persona, a manifestation of your psyche that summons a sort of guardian or demon to your side. You and this group then fight against the shadows and the towering dungeon of Tartarus in the aim of protecting people and figuring out the mystery behind it all. Now, story-wise, this is pretty good. It may be a little dark for fans of 4, considering it is much closer to the demonic story of previous SMT games, the shadows attacking anyone in reality, and the imagery of summoning personas by taking something that looks like a handgun and shooting yourself in the head with it. When it comes to gameplay, Persona 3 Portable is a turn-based RPG with dungeon crawling, monster collecting, and life sim elements thrown in. As you trek through it, you'll be fighting enemies in turn-based combat in dungeons, as well as managing your day-to-day life at school. Now, first of all, this new version of 3 is based on the PlayStation Portable port Persona 3 Portable. That means all cutscenes and navigation around town and school is through point-and-click menus and not 3D exploration. We also have the female protagonist option, new social links, the ability to directly command all party members instead of the AI acting on their own, and the list goes on. But they missed an opportunity to bring the Persona 3 FES content, which featured an entire sequel campaign after the main story ended, to modern platforms. Instead, they brought P3P, leaving FES in the world of emulation, with its most recent official release having been via the PlayStation 3's PS2 Classics catalog. Though to help make up for it, we do have some new options in this new port. You can now change your difficulty at any time you wish instead of just choosing it at the beginning of the game, and there are some handicap features, like giving you retries in battle, letting your party heal and continue when you go down, and letting you have more or less battle spoils like experience. But let's get to the game itself. Persona 3 is like a dungeon crawler and a life sim at the same time. Most of your time will be spent going through days at school, being able to interact with NPCs and forming bonds with them over time. Whether it's the cute nerd Chihiro or the mysterious online pen pal known as Maya. School life is really all about increasing stats and creating relationships and bonds. You have academics, charm, and courage as stats that you can use in the game for things like exams throughout the school year, so doing things to increase those stats is key to helping pass events later on. You can do this by going to a location in town or simply having the correct answers on days when a teacher gives you a pop quiz. But more importantly, we have social links that helps the dungeon crawling aspect. These have you spending time with someone on a certain day of the week. For example, Chihiro is available on Thursday and Saturday, and you can spend your after school time with her to get closer and form a relationship, upgrading your social link. Each one is based on an arcana or class of persona that you can create and equip, so increasing the social links will help you in the dungeon crawling. And this really falls into the main gameplay loop of how days work. When you go through each day, you go to class in the morning, you have after school time to do a social link, go to different places around town, and really just pick what you want to do between forming relationships or just increasing your stats. And then you go back to the dorm in the evening where you can either study and go to sleep, or you can trek through the dungeon of Tartarus. And that's really where the RPG side comes in. Every night, the Tartarus dungeon will show up during the dark hour, and depending on what your other party members are doing, you can visit the dungeon and trek through it. While in this area, you can navigate the dungeon as well as visit the Velvet Room, where you can take gathered personas to fuse them into new ones, take on side quests, or simply view all of the personas you've collected. But the actual dungeon is where all of the fun is. Tartarus is made up of floors where you navigate a 3D maze trying to climb the tower and get to the top. Shadows wander the maze and you can interact with them to fight. The combat system here is pretty standard turn-based stuff. You do attacks, skills, items, etc. There's a big elemental weakness system where you can stun enemies by exploiting those weaknesses and they can do the same for you. But the persona system helps keep things fresh. While the other characters have one set persona all the time for the entire game, you can equip several and freely swap between them in mid-combat, being able to take advantage of different abilities like the full party heal media or going for specific elemental weaknesses. The only real downside of the combat is the pacing. It may be from being spoiled by the later games, but Persona 3's combat feels very slow and sluggish to me. This is especially apparent for the delay between knocking enemies down and doing the all-out attack. To be honest, I more often than not just went for the auto battle rush mode, not because it was easier, but for the faster pacing. The one big complaint most people have is that P3 was a very grindy game where you barely got any experience for doing anything and had to level grind so much for each boss. But the new difficulty options here for getting more experience in battle really helped to fix this. I was able to go through pretty much the entire game just going through the new dungeon areas once per story sequence and was able to go fine against most of the bosses. Though I will admit that a lot of the mini bosses in Tartarus were still a pretty big challenge. But one thing that hasn't changed that I didn't really like from the first time I played this on the PlayStation Portable is the repetition of Tartarus. The dungeon has over 200 floors and somewhat changes across the game, but it looks like the exact same maze across the entire adventure. Green floors, purple floors with faces, just not very much variance to it. Now there are big dungeons for the events during each chapter, but Tartarus feels really samey for the entire journey. But getting past all that, let's go into content and length. These are all really long games. If you know what you're doing and rush through the game, you could probably complete this in around 50 hours. But my first time through the game back on the PlayStation Portable was over 75 hours. Next up, presentation, which is great and weird at the same time. You can tell they didn't do a thing to the graphics engine of this game in the transition from the PlayStation Portable to these more modern systems. All of the visuals do look really smooth and upscaled, but the 3D character models still have those PSP era blemishes, like hair looking blocky and even hands being solid pieces instead of fingers being separated. The renders do look good and smooth, but you can tell they're still PSP renders. The performance does balance things out. We have a perfect 60 FPS from the start to finish, which is the same performance you will get on the PlayStation 4. It's a beautifully optimized game. Now there are some reports of audio issues with these ports, though I personally haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary. With that out of the way, let's go into battery life. Persona 3 Portable gets a range of 3 to 4 hours on the original model, 3.5 to 5 hours on the Lite, 6 to 7 on the V2, and 6.5 to 8 on the OLED. In conclusion, Persona 3 returns to handhelds in the same form it did originally, for better or for worse. Now on the downside, it's a shame we didn't get the FES content, and the combat system feels a bit slow and sluggish when compared to newer entries. But for fans of the series, this is a great port of P3P and should definitely be played, as Persona 3 is a great RPG even without that extra campaign. Reviews to go rates Persona 3 Portable for the Nintendo Switch an 8 out of 10. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. Thank you for watching and have a great day.